Good afternoon. I want to start with a hypothetical, a little thought experiment. Imagine you're all jurors in a criminal case. It's a case of driving with a suspended license, and the person has done it twice. And it's open and shut. There's a huge amount of evidence, and in fact, the defendant makes the unprecedented move of getting on the stand and actually confessing to you, the jurors, I did it. So it's a pretty simple question I'll start with. How many people here, show of hands, if you were in the jury, would vote to convict? All right, so pretty much everyone, right? The guy confessed. Now imagine it's a couple years down the line and you run into the judge from the case. And he says, oh, I don't know if you knew this, but actually the penalty for driving with a suspended license in Massachusetts is death. And that guy, he was executed, so good job. So after hearing this, how many people, if you raised your hands that you would have voted to convict, how many people would now want to maybe go back in time, maybe change your verdict? Right, so again, pretty much everybody. And even if you didn't change your verdict, let me ask you one more question. Even if you stuck with your original answer, how many of you here would at least have wanted to know before you decided whether this man was guilty or innocent that the penalty was execution? So how many would want to at least know that, right? Okay, that's everybody in the room. And of course, this makes sense. The thought experiment is about the rationality of decision making, and it's really not too controversial. All of us always want all the information that we can have before we have to make a decision. In fact, if you are asked to make a decision, or in this case forced, and you don't have all the facts, you very might wind up with an irrational decision at the end, the wrong choice. In this case, you might have inadvertently sentenced a guy with a traffic offense to death. But this isn't a hypothetical. In fact, this is exactly how our criminal justice system works. In fact, jurors are forbidden by law from knowing the penalty of the crime that they're going to decide. So they cannot know what's going to happen to the person that they have to choose if they're guilty or innocent. And I'm here today to argue to you that this is a big, big problem. In fact, it is one of the greatest problems in our criminal justice system today. But you might be thinking, well, it only seemed like a problem because of the way you set up the hypothetical, right? You made it kind of absurd. You made it ridiculous. It only seemed like a problem because the actual result, death, was so far from the expected result that you'd probably all be thinking for a traffic offense. Well, that part of it, not really hypothetical either. I'm here today to tell you that, in fact, for many people, the penalty for driving with a suspended license is death. That's because of a little legal concept called collateral consequences. These are the civil penalties that are imposed beyond any jail time that a person may or may not do. I think we're all familiar with one of them. We all have heard that if you are convicted of a felony, you forever lose your right to vote. Well, it turns out that in Massachusetts, there are 290 additional collateral consequences beyond disenfranchisement. Just to name a few of them, if you're ever convicted of a felony in Massachusetts, you not only lose your right to vote, but you lose the ability to ever have food assistance again. If you're on food stamps, they're gone. If you are getting veterans benefits from serving our country, those are gone too. You can never become a citizen of the United States after a single conviction. Devastatingly, you are never eligible for student loans for the rest of your life. And if you're in college and you're on student loans, those are revoked. If you've happened to make it through college, but you're on a program to pay back your loans, not anymore. Your driver's license is suspended, so even if you can find a job, you're not going to be able to get back and forth. And maybe worst of all, if you have any type of lease with public housing of any kind, it's immediately terminated and you're evicted. Now that last one, where you are rendered homeless, that's not just for felonies. In fact, any drug conviction, down to a misdemeanor, results in your immediate eviction from public housing. Now, to make matters worse, all of these are mandatory and lifetime. That means that the judge has no discretion on whether or not or which of these collateral consequences to impose. In fact, the minute you as jurors come back with a guilty, all 291 of these are set down. And to make matters worse, on top of that, they are for the rest of your life. These are lifetime bans, and they're not just for major felonies. Some of you might be thinking this is only for the worst crimes. In fact, it's for any felony. And in the state of Massachusetts, that example I gave you, driving with a suspended license twice, that's a felony. If you sell any small little amount of marijuana, that's a felony. If you're in possession of what they call any measurable amount of cocaine, and that's typically what officers scrape out of a bag, that's a felony. So for these minor crimes, you have 291 collateral consequences that are imposed. Oh, here's another felony I forgot to mention, theft of $250 or more. Now that's the cell phone that you've got in your pocket right now, or maybe the handbag you walked in the door with. Steal that cell phone, that's a felony. You have 291 lifetime bans placed upon you. So I say again that, in fact, the penalty, the real penalty for driving with a suspended license in this state is death. It's a slow death, it's a death by pieces, but it's death nonetheless. Because taken together, all of these consequences are devastating. Now, they might not be to everyone in this room. Speaking personally, if I'd been convicted of a felony, I might not have even noticed. I was lucky enough to grow up not needing food stamps, not needing housing assistance, not even needing student loans. But I'm not everybody. I think we all know that there are millions of Americans who rely on these things to make it in life. They rely on housing assistance, they rely on food assistance, and if they ever have the hope of getting an education, they certainly rely on student loans. So I ask you to think about where you would be. Where would you be if you're sitting in this room if you had never had the opportunity to go to school? If you never had food on your plate, or if you never had a roof above your head? You would be hopeless. And that's what this is really about for these people. The imposition of these collateral consequences is the systematic destruction of their hope. It is the systematic destruction of them as a member of society, as a person. It takes away the reason to get up in the morning and keep trying. If you've been told that for the rest of your life, you can never have public housing again, never even get food assistance, and probably worst of all, never be able to go to school, why keep trying? Why keep fighting? And the death of that hope is death in and of itself. You take that away from someone and you leave them nothing. So one conviction, one mistake in this state, and you lose everything, never to be back on your feet again. And God knows we've all made mistakes. I have, everyone in this room has. But for us, we had the hope that we could move on, the hope that we could reclaim our lives, make something of ourselves, do better. But one felony conviction, and that hope is lost. Now, it goes without saying that this policy makes no sense from any standpoint, societal, economic, moral. And yet here it is. We're taking people and ostensibly punishing them because they committed a crime. And yet we're then putting them in a situation where they can do little else but commit further crimes, right? It's bizarre. It's Kafkaesque. It's completely absurd. And the more you think about it, the stranger it gets. Steal a cell phone, you can't go to college. Sell a dime bag of weed, you're evicted. To quote a colleague of mine, we're taking people who are accused of minor crimes and we're cutting them off at the knees such that they can never walk again. Just look at the economics of it. Take the educational example. On one side of a scale, think about the societal cost or the economic cost of the commission of one of these minor crimes, driving with a suspended license. And on the other end of the scale, think about the economic damage, the economic cost of taking someone and rendering them permanently unemployed and uneducated. And now multiply that by thousands. And the cost of doing this to members of our own society is astronomical. And again, it's bizarre. The more you think about it, the crazier it sounds. How could we have structured our society this way? What logical, rational society actually takes its own citizens and purposefully makes them incapable of producing, of being a productive member of society? And yet that's exactly what we do. So let's go back to the original hypothetical, but this time it's not a hypothetical. Now, knowing what you know, I'll give you the same set of facts. You're a juror on a case, and there's a young man. He's been accused of driving without a license for the second time. You know that he's a lower income individual. He's on housing assistance, and he's on food assistance. He's working as a barber, making some money, putting it away, hoping to be the very first person in his family to go to college, but he's going to need those student loans. So now, knowing what you know, he still gets up, And he still looks at the jury, all of you, and he confesses to the crime. You know he did it. And the judge tells you, you got this confession, you should convict. But now knowing what you know, that simple conviction will result in him being left homeless, hungry, and uneducated, who here would still want to convict? Pretty much nobody. So what do we do about this? What do we do about this problem? The solution I'm going to give to you, the potential solution, came to me after a little chat I had with a judge. I was in the middle of a case, and I was chit-chatting with this judge, and I kind of floated this idea to him. Said, Your Honor, I don't know, maybe it might make some sense if the jurors actually knew what was going to happen to my client. And in a absolute straight out of Central Casting, John Grisham's perfect Southern drawl, which I won't try to replicate, he said, well, counselor, we could never do that. We could never tell them. Because if the jurors ever found out what was going to happen to this man, they'd never convict. This is really kind of perverse when you think about it, right? But he's completely correct. And that gave me this idea. And let me just detour for a minute and talk a little bit about problem solving, taking a problem like this. I remember being a high school student and studying physics and learning about Einstein and how he developed his theories of relativity, general and special. And if there are any physicists in the room, I apologize, I'm going to mangle this. But the basic idea was that before Einstein, in physics equations, time was taken as a constant, which makes sense. It's time, right? We're not in a Star Trek episode. Time doesn't bend, it doesn't change. So that's what people believed. Time was constant. And then Einstein comes along, and he throws everything out. He throws out all the assumptions. And in his model of gravitation, time actually did bend, expand, contract. And it was the speed of light that was constant across all reference frames. This was an absolutely bizarre idea at the time. But as we all know now, he was completely right. And what this taught me was not just something about physics and the way the world worked, but something about problem solving and something about thinking. That what made Einstein so brilliant is he was able to take the most basic assumption, the thing that everyone just believed to be true and just couldn't be changed, and he started from scratch and threw that out too. And it's a valuable lesson in any type of problem solving. And so the judge in my story, right, he's like the pre-Einsteinian physicist. For him, there's this simple assumption that can never change, that if you're guilty, you must be convicted. And he's so set in that assumption that he's willing to deny information to juries happily to make sure that that constant remains true, to make sure that if you are in fact guilty, you are in fact convicted, no matter what the cost. So what I urge you to do is become that judge's worst nightmare. And like Einstein, throw out that assumption. Throw out the basic assumption that just because you're guilty, you need to be convicted. And you alone have the power to do this, because as jurors and as potential jurors, you are actually the single most powerful political entity in our country. Because you have a special power that no one tells you about. This is kind of a theme in my talk, what the government isn't telling you, right? You have a power called jury nullification, and it's an incredible power. And what that means is that you have the right as jurors, that no matter what the law says, no matter what the judge says, no matter what the prosecutor says, and no matter what you hear about the case, you always have the right to acquit, no matter what. And this is an incredible power. It actually means that you are a human check on the power of the judiciary and the legislature every time you sit on a case. You have the power to be more than just a simple engine that determines guilt or innocence. You have the power to do exactly what you feel is fair and just. Because a jury is supposed to be more than just simply a machine that spits out guilty, not guilty. Originally, a juror was supposed to be the voice of their community, the will of their community. And so I urge you to take up this power, shoulder this mantle, and be the voice of your community, and speak loudly. And tell that judge who made that pithy remark to me, and tell every other judge like him, that you, as the voice of your community, are no longer willing to allow people to be crippled, cut off in the knees, and banished for the commission of minor crimes. Let that judge know that until this changes, you are happy to let guilty people walk out the door to make sure that no one's life is destroyed over nothing ever again. Because I promise you one thing, people will sit up and take notice. You could spend years writing your legislatures, years lobbying, and I don't see this changing. But believe me, that the minute these judges start to watch quote-unquote guilty people walking out the door because you raised your voice and said, we will accept this no longer, the minute that happens, things are going to start changing. So do it. Sit on juries, and if you hear the case and you believe that the consequences you now know about don't fit the crime you heard, I urge you to acquit, no matter what. Thank you.